Right, before I went away, we had started another journey through the book of Revelation. And as before, on the other occasions when we went through, I've been starting at a maybe it seems an awkward place, starting at chapter 4. I'm really concentrating on chapters 4 to 19. And the real reason is because I think that those are the chapters that are, first of all, most misunderstood. And secondly, I believe that the heart of Revelation's message is found between chapter 4 and chapter 19. You know, by the time we come to chapter 20 and onwards, you could say the story is over. What I mean is that by the time you come to chapter 20, everybody who is to be saved will be saved, and everybody who is to be lost will be lost. And the issues are settled, and Christ has received his kingdom. What happens afterwards is like just a formality, even though it's interesting. And what happens before in chapters 1 to 3, it seems like an introduction. The real action begins in chapter 4. And this is why I've been starting with chapter 4. You know, I've been really wanting to deal with those parts of the book that are most significant to those of us who live at this time. So that's where we are. But of course, in the first 4 presentations, which we had already, we were looking at the book of Daniel. And just a reminder as to why this is important. The reason is that the key to unlocking revelation is found in the book of Daniel. We saw very clearly that God has given us a link between Daniel and Revelation. We looked at chapter 10 of Revelation, where we saw the little book opened, and we looked at chapter 12 of Daniel, where we saw the little book closed. And God has given us this connection because he's saying Daniel and Revelation are linked together. In the book of Daniel, the secret is locked away. Clearly, God says it is locked away until the time of the end. In the time of the end, the secret is unlocked. Daniel's book is opened, and we get a clearer understanding, a more detailed description in the book of Revelation. But Revelation is always going to be misunderstood. The message is always difficult or impossible to decipher unless we find that key in Daniel. And that is why we spent the first 4 meetings again going back over the book of Daniel, going back over the main point of Daniel, going back over the key in the book of Daniel. If I may just summarize, what we saw is that the theme of the book of Daniel, the main point in the book of Daniel, it might be summarized in this way. God is focusing on the development and the overthrow of kingdoms. The prophecies of Daniel focus on the overthrow of great kingdoms, great empires. Every one of the prophecies talk about kingdoms arising and kingdoms falling. That's point number 1. And point number 2 is that these kingdoms are judged before they are overthrown. We see that this is brought out very clearly in Daniel chapter 6, where Belshazzar's Babylon governed by Belshazzar, is judged by Belshazzar. God says to Belshazzar, your kingdom is weighed in the balances, you are found wanting, and your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. God judged Babylon, or the heavenly tribunal judged Babylon before it was overthrown. So Daniel 7 shows us that this sequence of judgment and overthrow is carried out right until the end. By the time you come to the 4th beast, which is the kingdom of Rome, there is a judgment that divides between that makes a decision concerning the kingdom of Rome. that it is to be given to the burning flame, and the same judgment makes a decision concerning the kingdom of Christ, that it is to last forever and ever. And that is kind of the background we looked at. So the main idea is that the focus of the book of Daniel, or the emphasis of Daniel, is judgment, the judgment and overthrow of kingdoms. So we saw that the last moment of time there will be a judgment that concerns two kingdoms, the kingdom of the beast, the kingdom of Rome, and the kingdom of Christ. And so this judgment, the details of it and the story of it, is transferred to Revelation, the book of Revelation. And that is what Revelation is about. So this is where we will pick up this evening. So we're actually going to go now to the book of Revelation, and we're going to pick up in chapter 4, where we see the outline of this judgment. So let me go to let me share the Bible. So what we're going to do this evening, I'm going to make a comparison between what we see in Daniel 7 and what we see in Revelation 4 and 5, to show us that clearly God is saying what we saw in Daniel is what we are looking at in Revelation. Sometimes the Bible does not, well, very often, and I would say most of the time, God does not tell us clearly what it is that we are looking at. But he gives us clues, he shows us connections that are so striking and so clear that anybody with a little ability to comprehend can tell it's talking about the same thing. I mean, sometimes he's very, very definite. For example, in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 8, look at what God is very definite here, because look at what he says. He talks about a goat and a ram, and then he comes and he tells you very clearly in verse 20, the ram which you saw having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So this is a very detailed explanation of the vision. So sometimes God does that, but most of the time he doesn't do it. Most of the time he only tells you about something happening, and then you have to figure out what is this talking about. You have to look for clues. And this is what we're going to do this afternoon by looking at a comparison between the books of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7, and Revelation chapters 4 and 5. We're going to see the connection that makes us know it's the same thing we are looking at. Now, I understand that all of us, or most of us, have gone through this before. But I as we go through each time, what you can see and what I have found is that we are seeing little details, little details that give us a clearer picture. It's one thing to know the truth, but as you look at it more closely, sometimes it makes the conviction you have stronger, and it gives you a greater appreciation of how important this is to God. So I want to make a comparison here between Daniel 7. Daniel 7 is on the left, and I want us to look at what happens in verses. Let me start from verse 30. It says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven. That's not what I'm looking for. Okay. Verse 9, verses 9 and 10. I beheld till the thrones were cast down. And the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set and the books were opened. So first thing I want to point out is the last statement. We don't have any question about what we are looking at. It tells us that what we are looking at is the judgment. The judgment was set, and furthermore, it tells you what kind of judgment. It says the books were open. So one of the reasons why we're going through this in some kind of detail is because I would think that probably the majority of Christians in the world, the majority of Christians believe that this is talking about the last great judgment, you know, at the great white throne of God after the 1,000 years. There are many people who have abandoned Adventism, kind of people who are no longer, they don't any longer have confidence in the Adventist church, as most of us are at that position. But what they have done is that they have simply abandoned everything. And so, you know, they say that there's no need for a judgment before Jesus comes again. And, you know, because the idea of the investigative judgment has so many harmful ideas connected to it, they reject it. But in doing this, they completely abandon the thought of a judgment in heaven before Jesus comes again. So they reject this idea. And so when it says the judgment was set and the books were open, they say it applies to the judgment at the end of the 1,000 years. So I want you to see, I want us to see very clearly that this is wrong, wrong, wrong. That is a false idea. This judgment takes place in heaven before Jesus returns to earth. So the first point is the last point. What we are looking at is the judgment. So something is happening in heaven, and the first thing that happens, it says that John says, I saw till the thrones were cast down. Now, I want to look at that in another translation because it's a crude translation. Let me see what it says in the NASB. Yeah, more appropriate. I kept looking until thrones were set up, not cast down, but set up. It's a little different, isn't it? The King James Version says it gives you the impression that somebody picked up some thrones and flung them to the ground. But the better idea, the more appropriate idea is that thrones were set in place. What does it say in the NIV? Yeah, exactly. As I looked, thrones were set in place. What it is talking about is like somebody is arranging a room. So I don't know who these people were, maybe the angels, but they came and they put some seats or some thrones in place. He goes on to say, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Now, this person is clearly God the Father. He takes a seat, but he takes a seat because, first of all, somebody comes and puts down some thrones in place, and then God takes his seat. Now, I'm going to go back to the King James Version as much as the NIV simplifies it, but I have greater trust in the King James Version for the most part. Now, what I want to do is go over to Revelation 4, and I want to show you what happens there. We are bearing this in mind that we just read. Thrones are set in place, and God took a seat. Now, over in Revelation 4, John says, I looked and I saw a door standing open in heaven. Let me give you the King James Version as well. I looked, and behold, I saw a door was opened in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet talking with me, which said, come up hither, come up here, and I will show you things which must be hereafter. I'm going to come back and look at this. Let me go down a little bit first. And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. Compare these two statements. They are saying exactly the same thing. The statement in Revelation on the right panel is what John saw. he saw a throne was set in heaven. The equivalent in Daniel 7 is that he says thrones were set in place. Now, I acknowledge that in Revelation it says a throne. But let me explain. A little further down, it says in verse 4, and round about the throne there were 24 seats. Now, let me bring up the Greek translation and you will find, let me see, 24 seats. Seats is from the Greek word G2362, and the meaning is, the word is thronos, Thronas, and it means a throne. Okay, so in actual fact, it says that these 24 elders were not, even though King James Version translated as they were sitting upon seats. There were 24 seats. It was actually the literal Greek reading is that there are 24 thrones. So it matches with what we read in Daniel when it says thrones were set in place, because it's not only God's throne, it's also the thrones for the 24 elders. That's what Daniel was seeing. He saw a throne set in place. Now, both Daniel and John mentioned that there was one person sitting on the throne. One sat on the throne. And in Daniel, it tells you that this person is the Ancient of Days. He took a seat. So, both Daniel and Revelation show us that on the throne of heaven, there's only one person who is sitting. Daniel refers to him as the Ancient of Days. John doesn't give him that name, but John just describes what he sees. He says one was sitting on the throne. All right, let me pause a little and go back a little bit further, back in this chapter in Revelation. Now, John says, I looked and I saw a door open in heaven. Okay, so maybe what John saw was, let me see, I should have an illustration of this. All right, so maybe he saw a door, and when he went through the door, he found himself in heaven. That could be one explanation, okay? A door was open, and the door took him into heaven. Or it could mean that he was taken into heaven, and he saw a door open within heaven itself. So if there's a door open within heaven itself, it means that in heaven there are apartments. Now, I'm not going to suggest which one it is. I don't know. It could be that he saw a door open that took him into heaven. But I'm tempted to believe it means that he saw into heaven and he saw within heaven a door opened. So it suggests to me that at least what John is seeing is that there are apartments or rooms in heaven. And he saw a door that took you into a certain room. Now, why am I suggesting this? Look back at the picture. He says thrones were set in place. Where? It must be at a certain spot. What was at that place before the thrones were set in place? I don't know, but clearly there were no seats there. There were no thrones there. All right? Somebody came and they put thrones in place. And then God came and took a seat. So the point I'm making is that this is not a normal day in heaven. If somebody asks you, what does heaven look like? You might say, go and look at Daniel chapter 7, or go and look at Revelation chapter 4. And you would be only partly right, because this is not a normal day in heaven. If you go to heaven on a normal day, you would not see everybody sitting on thrones with 24 elders and millions of angels and 4 living creatures. You would not see this. I don't know if you are getting the point I'm making, but the point is that the reason why we are shown these things is because it's a special occasion in heaven. Something is happening in heaven, and for this occasion, thrones are placed in this particular place. That's why I'm saying it could be in a particular room in heaven, and maybe those rooms are hundreds of miles big. I don't know. I can't imagine heaven, but I believe that at least we are given a picture that our human minds can kind of grasp some kind of idea. So the whole point is that God is saying something special is happening in heaven. And so the thrones are put in place. God takes a seat. And John is told to come up here because we are going to show you something that will take place after this. And when it says after this, it means after the time of John. Now, John lived until about AD 100, thereabouts, 70 years after Jesus went back to heaven. So this is not talking about when Jesus was crowned, when Jesus came into his kingdom, his spiritual kingdom. It's not talking about when Jesus, his sacrifice was accepted and all things were put under his feet. No, it's not talking about this time. It's talking about something that will happen in the future to John's time. Somebody's on. It's something that happens future to the time of John. Now, I'm going through all this in detail because here's the thing, brothers and sisters. You see, some of these ideas, they are connected with Adventism. Some of these ideas are connected with Adventism. And every time I come up on something like this, I am careful to make the point that we are not teaching Adventist doctrine, we are teaching Bible doctrine. Okay? None of, I think we're open-minded people in this fellowship. We're open-minded. That's why we are here. In other words, we are people who are willing to look at things strictly with an open mind, willing to look at the evidence and not lean towards denominationalism or traditional bias. So I'm making the point that some of these things have been associated with Adventism because I think Adventism, either they were given some of these things from God or they stumbled upon it. But I look at the Bible and whether it is Adventism or not, I don't care. It is Bible. And I'm going through point by point because if anybody is skeptical and thinking, Brother David is only thinking like this because, he was raised as an Adventist or he has association with Adventism. I want you to understand that this is an unfair conclusion. I am strictly going by the Bible, and that's what I'm trying to show you. That's why I'm going into these details. I want you to see for yourself that this is not something I am imposing on the scriptures. It's something that we get if we look at the scriptures carefully. I hope everybody can understand that. So the details of the verse tells you John is taken into heaven. He's told, come up here and I'm going to show you things that must be after this. John is taken into heaven to see a future event, something future to the time of John. Why am I highlighting this? Because Pentecost was before this, long before. The Passover was before this, the death of Christ, the pouring out of the Holy Spirit, the establishing of the kingdom. It was many decades before John had this vision. But at the time when John had this vision, he was told it was regarding things that would be in the future. So after the time of John, sometime in the future, up in heaven, something is to happen of great importance. And Daniel tells us that it is the judgment. The judgment was set and the books were opened. Now, Revelation is giving us details. And God takes John into heaven specifically to show him this event. That's why I'm making the point that this is not a normal day in heaven. This is a day in heaven when there's a special convocation. Whether it's a day, I don't think it's a day, it's an occasion. Maybe it spans years, maybe it spans decades, but it's an event in heaven. And John is told to come up here to observe what is happening. Now, let me make a point. Another point. From this point on, Revelation reads like a storybook. One of the problems with Revelation, when people come to Revelation, is they see it as a disjointed collection of little prophecies about the future. They don't connect the thing together, but it is like you are reading a story. It reads like a book. It follows a definite logical sequence with one event following the next event in a logical sequence. And if you can't see the sequence, it's because you don't understand the book. I mean, there are one or two places where God breaks the sequence and he does something for a certain purpose, but for the most part, you can see the story unfolding. Now, this is true with a qualification. Here's a qualification. Chapter 4 to chapter 11, you have the complete story. Then the story begins again in chapter 12 and it goes to chapter 19, and you have the same story told twice. Why? Because in one case, we are looking at the story from the perspective of the kingdom of Christ. And in the other case, we're looking at the story again, the same story, but from the perspective of the kingdom of the beast. So it's the two kingdoms on display. We are showing the two kingdoms. And the history of these two kingdoms, they overlap, they happen together. But at the same time, God shows us in part 1 and part 2 of the book of Revelation. All right, so I pause a little bit and I ask, is there anything I just said that was difficult to understand? Let me know. All right, great. So let's continue with so John is taken up into heaven to see a future event, and we see that this future event was a judgment. So we compare what happens, and we see that the description is the same. Thrones are set in place, and God takes a seat. It tells you his throne was like the fire of flame, and his wheels like burning fire. Now, in Revelation, it doesn't say the same thing. It says instead, if you look at verse 5, out of the throne there proceeded lightnings. It's a little detail, but let me see what it says in another version, if there's another one. And NIV says, from the throne there came flashes of lightning. So John really does use the word lightning. Right? John says there was lightning coming out of the throne. Now, what it says in the book of Daniel is that a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Now, granted, there are two different statements. And if you're a legalist, you will say it's two different things, it's not the same. But if you apply your mind to it, one of the things that happened to me sometime many years ago was that I sat down and I tried to draw a picture of everything that I saw in the book of Revelation, everything that I read. And if you are to draw a throne with lightning coming out of the throne, possibly if you drew it the way John saw it, what it would look like is like a stream of fire or a fiery stream, because there's a lot of similarity between lightning and a fiery stream. It depends on who is describing it. Another way you could describe it is electrical sparks or electrical, yeah, more than sparks. I mean, the way I think about it, if you have ever seen in a welding shop, somebody turns on a grinder and they put a piece of metal and you see those sparks shooting all over the place. Both John and the Daniel are trying to describe something that they have never seen before. It's possible that what we are talking about is just streams of electrical power flowing out of the throne of God. Daniel compares it to a stream because a stream is something that flows and it doesn't stop. And what he sees coming out of the throne of God is a flowing stream of light, sparkling light, and he compares it to a stream of fire. John sees the same thing, and John compares it to lightnings coming out of the throne. You could say a stream of lightning. So I'm making the point because I'm saying there's not a contradiction. It's just two people describing the same thing, and they're using different words. The Bible is full of that, and that's one thing we have to consider when we read the Bible, because God, in many cases, God did not tell the people which words to use. He told them, he gave them a picture. They looked at the picture and they chose the words to describe that picture based on how they viewed the thing. It's like, you know, one book in the Bible says that Jesus was they dressed him in a scarlet robe. Another one says that they dressed him in a purple robe. Some of these stupid critics of the Bible I've seen them put that in as a contradiction. They say that the Bible contradicts itself because one of the writers, and I don't remember if it's Matthew, Mark, or Luke, says that Jesus was wearing a scarlet robe. And another one says he was wearing a purple robe. Now, how would you explain that? Well, I'll tell you. Sometimes I'm looking at something and it is straight green, and my wife says it is blue. So, if we were writing a book, my wife would say she saw a blue thing, and I would say it's green. I saw a green thing. Now, somebody would say we are contradicting each other, and somebody would say one of us is a liar. But the simple thing is that we have two different sets of eyes, and we are seeing slight shades, and we are describing it differently. Purple and scarlet are close enough that somebody can describe it differently, and it's simple. So that happens because of the way people perceive and explain what they perceive. Now, the next thing that I will highlight is that it says, thousands ministered unto him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And just as it says this, it goes on to say the judgment was set and the books were opened. Now, again, if you are a person who is not reading carefully, if you see this statement, 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, the judgment was set and the books were opened. Tie those two statements together, and something will naturally come to your mind. And what will come to your mind is Revelation chapter 20. And it says in Revelation 20, and I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. Now, honestly, this sounds very much like what we read in Revelation, in Daniel, very much. And that is one of the reasons why, we have this admonition to rightly divide the word of truth. This looks like the judgment in Daniel 7, but it is not. There are similarities because it says God is sitting on a throne, and millions are standing before God, the dead, small and great. Books are open. Same thing happens here in Daniel 7. But it's not the same event. This event is happening at the end of the 1,000 years when all the dead are raised to life. This event is happening in heaven before Jesus comes again. But understandably, people say it's the same thing. But I'll show you that these people who are standing here, this 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands, is not the dead, small and great, standing before God. And the same book that we are looking at in Revelation here makes it clear. Go back to Revelation 4, where we are seeing this throne in heaven and one sitting on the throne. Then you skip over to chapter 5, where you get a more information about what is going on. And look at what happens now. You go down to verse 11. Revelation 5, verse 11. And I want you to compare it with what we see here in Daniel 7. Daniel 7 says, thousands ministered to him, 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Are these people who are going to be judged? No, because Revelation 5 and verse 11 says, and I beheld and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne and the beast and the elders. And the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. Exactly what it says here in Daniel. It tells you who are these that are standing before God. It's not people who are going to be judged. It's angels, the same exact phrase. Thousands of thousands. There it says it. Thousands. 10,000 times 10,000. There it says it. 10,000 times 10,000. It's the same group. God does not tell us simply. What he does is simply use language that makes it abundantly clear to anybody who has a brain. It's abundantly clear. God is saying it's the same people I was speaking about in Daniel 7. And here he tells us that it's the voice of many angels round about the throne, and it tells you the number of these angels. All right, so we can conclude that these thousands and 10,000 times 10,000 who stood before God in this judgment are angels. They are not sinners gathered together before God to be judged. All right, so I'm going to go to my PowerPoint screen. I have some illustrations that I'm going to go to because I want to make sure that we have a thorough understanding of what I'm trying to say. So what we can say then is that the book of Revelation consists of the kind of outline. I'm going to give an outline. The first three chapters are an introduction and the letters to the 7 churches, and we're not going to look at that in great detail at the moment. Then chapters 4 to chapter 11 is what I said is where the action really is. It speaks about the judgment of the kingdom of Christ, and we will spend a lot of time focusing on what is happening here. Then we have chapters 12 to chapter 19, which is speaking about the same thing, the same history, but this time it's from the perspective of the kingdom of the beast. And if we understand what we saw in Daniel 7, the judgment is looking at the history of the beast, and then the beast is finally given to the burning flame. The judgment also looked at the history of Christ's kingdom, and he's given an everlasting kingdom. This is what we are looking at in the book of Revelation. Then, of course, in the last 3 chapters of Revelation, we have the final closing remarks, closing events, the millennium, the final judgment, the new earth, and closing exhortation. So this is the shape of the book of Revelation. If you get this basic idea in mind, then you have a key to know where to put. Whatever you come upon in the book of Revelation, you know exactly where to put it once you have this overall view. Here's a little bit more detail. So in the first part, the first section where we see the kingdom of Christ examined, we have Christ's kingdom judged, the beast kingdom is judged. A little bit more detail. The history of Christ's church is examined. That is the 7 seals. The history of the beast is revealed. That's in Revelation 12 and 13 and also 17. In Revelation 11, you have the final preaching of the gospel. And in Revelation 13, you have the final assault against Christians. All of these events correspond to each other, but they are in the 2 different sections. Revelation 7 shows you the followers of Christ are examined and they are sealed. And of course, Revelation 13 and 14 shows you that the followers of the beast are marked with the mark of the beast. Revelation 8 shows you the close of probation or the end of grace, and Revelation 14 shows you the same thing. In Revelation 11, Christ receives his kingdom. The kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of Christ. And in Revelation 19, the beast is thrown into the burning flame. So what I'm saying is that both sections cover the same period of time, but different perspective. And I hope everybody understands that. So, and then we come to the open door in heaven. One sits on the throne, and John is actually in heaven at this point. Now, this picture, I know Sister Destiny will probably recognize it because I actually took the picture from a Jehovah's Witness book. Now, it's not very, the picture, the colors are not very clear, so you might not be able to see clearly what is happening. But it's the details that they have put in is the reason why I chose to use this picture, because I like the details. Let me see if I can just use a little marker. So right here is supposed to be the throne of God. And out of the throne, you have fire, but they have the fire going up into the air. They have the lightning going up in the air. And the reason is because, of course, they don't understand the connection between Revelation 4 and Daniel 7. If they understood, then the lightning, the fire would be coming out, the lightning would be coming out from the bottom of the throne. Here you have the 4 living creatures around the throne. And around here are the 24 elders sitting here on these seats. And here are the 7 lamps of fire before the throne, which represents the Holy Spirit. Here is Jesus in the middle, standing before the throne. And round about here, this orange-looking periphery, these are the millions of angels that are standing there. So they tried hard to put in the different elements. So, and as much as that, and as far as that goes, it's a fairly good picture. So I borrowed it and wanted to use it to give us an idea of what John might have seen. Anyway, he's taken into heaven, and what we have seen is that John he's here in heaven. He has been taken into heaven. And I would like us to remember this, because as we continue to study through the chapters that are ahead of us, we need to remember where John is, because sometimes the Bible talks about something happening somewhere, and we get confused and we think it is happening somewhere else. But remember, John is in heaven, and everything that John is seeing is taking place in heaven. This is one of the keys to understanding Revelation. If you see a horse riding, where is this horse riding? This horse is not riding on earth. This horse is riding in heaven, because John is in heaven and John is seeing something happening in heaven. Remember what has happened. God has taken John into heaven, into this room, at this location, for this particular event. And what is the event? It is the judgment. It is a pre-advent judgment. So now that John is here and he's looking at the judgment, he sees certain things happening, and God gives it to us in symbols. We're going to look at these symbols because, of course, what you know is that the symbols are represented as horses. It starts by showing horses, but we are not really we're not to understand horses. What we are to understand is the data in the judgment is being unveiled. The data that is being used in the judgment, we could say the books are opened and the data is being examined, and the data is represented as a horse for some reason. We will take time and look at that more closely, because you know one of the interpretations out there, people say that the white horse represents the Antichrist, and the red horse represents war, and the black horse represents famine, and the pale horse represents massive death. And this seems like, on the surface, it seems like a feasible explanation. But when you understand that what we are looking at is the data in the judgment, everything changes. That is why, to understand the background and to understand the parameters of what we are examining is so important. Once you get the picture correct, the overall picture, then the parts will take care of themselves. So I hope this is something we can see very clearly. So John is in heaven and he's looking at this scene. And we already went through this, but I'll just do a quick review since I have the chart here. So Daniel says that thrones were cast down and God took a seat. And we saw that the same thing happened in Revelation 4. It says a fiery stream issued from the throne. Revelation 4 says that out of the throne there was lightnings. We saw the same thing. Daniel says that books are opened. Revelation tells us that there is a book sealed with 7 seals. Now Daniel says books, and Revelation says one book, but the book has 7 compartments or 7 divisions. It's the book of 7 seals. So it's just another way that God describes the same event. Books open, book open, same event. Daniel says that, you know, millions, 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands stand before him. And as we saw, John shows us that this number consists of angels. So this visual similarity makes us know that God is saying, if you want to understand what is happening in Revelation, Go back to Daniel 7, and I told you in Daniel 7 that it was the judgment. The judgment was set and the books were opened. So Revelation chapter 4 opens up the same judgment, and it gives us that open door now into understanding what follows in chapters 5 to chapter 11. It's the judgment. Now, there are some elements here, and I think we have time to look at them. All right, round about the throne, John saw 4 living creatures. And I just highlighted these creatures, but let's look at them again. Here's one of them. Here's another one. Here's another one. In this, again, Jehovah's Witness picture. They are standing around the throne. And I want to look at them a little bit more closely. What we have on the right is what is the heads that were on these creatures. Now, John says one of them had the head of a man, one had the head of an eagle, one had the head of a calf, and one had the head of a lion. They were also described as having wings, 6 wings. Each of them had 6 wings. And these are the living creatures who are around the throne of God, and they are day and night, they are saying, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. And it says they don't stop saying this forever. That's what they are saying. We know it is a symbolic representation. But if we are to understand what God is saying in Revelation, we need to understand these symbols. So, if you see these creatures with these heads, and if you conclude that it means that there are creatures like this in heaven, you know, I know that the last time I said this, somebody disagreed with me, and they said that, well, they don't think it would be grotesque or queer for people, for beings to be in heaven who actually look like this. Well, maybe, okay, but I don't think that that is what God is saying to us. Revelation is not giving us an artistic view of heaven. It's not an artist's view. It's what view would I say? It's a puzzle maker's view. I don't know. There must be a better word than puzzle maker. It's a jigsaw puzzle designer, and it's more than a jigsaw puzzle. It's a maker of mysteries who designed Revelation. We're not looking at an artist's view of heaven. We are looking at the view of a mystery maker. The person who designed Revelation was crafting a mystery. He wanted to create a mystery that would take difficulty, hard work, and great inspiration to decipher. So what did this person do? And of course, we know it was God. But what did he do? He filled it with symbolic images. Everything is imagery. So one of the keys is that we look at the images and we try to figure out what is the idea behind the image. I want to tell you that this is one of the most rewarding approaches to take in studying the Bible. I mean, I'm not going to suggest to you that everything in the Bible follows this pattern, because if I did, I would open the door to all kinds of foolishness, and I myself would be guilty of foolishness. For the most part, the Bible is telling a story, and the story reads in a logical and simple way. But there are times and places where deep truth is deliberately put in difficult language by our Creator, because these secrets are intended to reach a certain target audience and at a certain point in time. What God does is unfold certain things at particular times, because they become answers to questions. They become catalysts for great developments in his church at certain points in time. They are the work of a master designer. And so from that perspective alone, I am persuaded that these four living creatures are not creatures who look like this. But we are given these images because God wants us to look at the images and try to figure out why. How? What do they mean? Now, there's something else about them too. Let me see if I have this. Okay, the other thing that it says about them in verses 6 to 8, same Revelation 4. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were four beasts, these same living creatures. They were full of eyes before and behind, and they were full of eyes within. I have highlighted the fact that they were full of eyes. That's another detail that is important. It has meaning. As I said, you need to look at these things. We need to look at these things and ask, why did God say this? You know, is it that there is a group of beings in heaven who are full of eyes behind them and in front of them? I mean, when you see eyes, you think, what is the purpose of eyes, and why does God show us a lot of eyes? What is he saying? And so I'm going to come to this, but let me go back to these four living creatures first and the heads. Now, honestly, I can't find too much. I couldn't find too much regarding these four heads. And in fact, I couldn't even find much about it in the Bible. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10, Ezekiel has a vision. It's the vision of the wheels within the wheel. And he says there were some living creatures that were flying before these wheels. And anywhere that the Spirit of God was to go, these creatures went in that direction. And it says each one of them, every one of them had these four heads. Every one of them had four heads. One looked like a calf, one like a man, one like an eagle, and one like a lion. So it has the same description as these creatures in Revelation. But in Revelation, it says four creatures and each one has one head. But in Ezekiel, it says every one of them had four heads. Now, in my opinion, of course, we are looking at a symbolic description. And so it's presented one way to Ezekiel, and it's presented another way to John in the book of Revelation. But it's focusing on the same thing. Now, here is the best information that I could find. I don't know if somebody else can find better information, but I actually went into commentators and I saw where a couple of commentators said something that makes sense, begins to make sense to me. Here's what it says. Albert Barnes, if you read Uriah Smith's Daniel and the Revelation, you notice that he quotes a lot from Barnes. And here's what Albert Barnes says. Tradition, he's talking about tradition. And we don't use tradition as doctrine, but many times tradition is based on something that is true. You just don't use it as the basis of a Bible, of a doctrine. But here, tradition is what is historically believed. And I think this has to do with maybe Jewish tradition. Tradition appropriates the four angelic forms. Let me translate it because it's awkward and crude Old English. Tradition applies these four angelic forms, the lion, the man, the ox, and the eagle, to the camps of Judah. Reuben, to the camps of Judah, Reuben, Ephraim, and Dan, respectively. As far as this goes, there is a certain support from Genesis 49 and verse 9, and also from Deuteronomy 33 and verse 17. So what Albert Barnes says is that traditional teaching, not Bible teaching now, it says that these four animals were assigned, or they were associated with, the tribes of Judah, Reuben, Ephraim, and Dan. Now these four tribes were the heads of certain groups. When the Israelites were marching through the wilderness, they were gathered in groups of threes. There were four camps, and every camp had three. And one camp was led by Judah, one by Reuben, one by Ephraim, and one by Dan. That's what he's saying. And he's saying that you can find some support for this idea in Genesis 49 and verse 9. And in Genesis 49 and verse 9, Judah is compared to a lion. That's what he's saying. So there's a little bit of support here because Judah is compared to a lion. That makes sense. And he says, Ephraim, Deuteronomy 33 and verse 17. Let's see what it says in Deuteronomy 33 and verse 17. All right, Deuteronomy 33 and verse 17 is speaking of Joseph. And you know, Ephraim was the son of Joseph. And in verse 17 it says, his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. They are the 10 tribes of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. All right, so what Barnes is saying is that there is a little support for this idea if you look at Deuteronomy 33 verse 17 and also Genesis 49 and verse 9. But anyway, the whole idea is based on tradition. But I'll show you why it makes sense in just a moment. I'll show you why I think it makes a lot of sense. Let's look at what Sir Isaac Newton said. Sir Isaac Newton was this great scientist, but what people don't know was that he was an outstanding commentator on the Bible. And he has actually written a book about Revelation, I think. He says the people of Israel in the wilderness encamped round about the tabernacle. On the east side, there were 3 tribes under the standard of Judah. On the west, there were 3 tribes under the standard of Ephraim. On the south, 3 tribes under the standard of Reuben. And on the north, there were 3 tribes under the standard of Dan. The standard of Judah was a lion, that of Ephraim an ox, that of Reuben was a man, and that of Dan was an eagle. Now again, clearly, this is not clearly stated in the Bible. So I'm going by what these commentaries have said. But it makes a lot of sense to me in the context of the judgment, and I'll show you why. We go back to this passage where it says that these same living creatures were full of eyes. Now, if you are full of eyes, what does it mean? It suggests that you have a capacity to see that is more than anybody else. Okay, I have 2 eyes. All of us have 2 eyes, so we're probably equal. Well, I have 2 assistants, so I have 2 eyes expanded with my glasses. All right. In Jamaica, they used to call people with glasses 4 eyes. But God shows us these living creatures full of eyes because God is saying that part of the mission of these 4 living creatures is to see. Part of their business is to see, and they see better than anybody else in heaven. Well, of course, minus God. Okay, but of all the creatures that are in heaven, the ones that see the best are these 4 living creatures. Now, I think the 4 living creatures represent 4 categories of angels. I think these angels are the angels that are associated or connected to Israel or to God's people. Why do they have eyes? Because they see everything. They're able to, if this is the judgment, as I am saying, then what you need in the judgment is witnesses. One great misconception that people have is that they keep saying God sees everything. That's not a misconception, but that's a misconception to apply this in the judgment. They say there's no need for a judgment because God sees everything. This, brothers and sisters, is a massive mistake. Do you know why? They think that the judgment is judging you. They think you need to be judged, and so they think God is judging you, and so because God knows everything, there's no need for a judgment. But this is nonsense because, as we know, there is a judgment. The Bible tells you clearly. Jesus says, every idle word that men shall speak, they give an account in the day of judgment. The Bible is full of this theme of judgment. So it's nonsense to say that because God knows everything, there's no need of a judgment.
But here's the point. What is clear is that God is sitting in the judgment, but God is not the one who is doing the judging. That's a critical point. God is not the one who is doing the judging. And in fact, when you understand clearly, what we see is that God ultimately is the one who is being judged. God's government is under investigation. And so if God's government is under investigation, God's knowledge and God's foreknowledge cannot be used in the judgment because God himself is the one being investigated in a sense. So we have witnesses. We have people who are seeing I have to mute somebody speaking. We have people who are seeing, we have beings who are seeing everything. They are putting the data in the judgment. They are there because they are witnesses. They have been around the people of God. They see what happens in this kingdom of Christ. They see how the government of Christ is working out. Yes, they're also seeing the hypocrites and the false pretenders, and this also is a part of the judgment. But the main point is that the kingdom of Christ is what is being assessed and judged. And so there are witnesses there. There are the people who have been, there are the angels who have been assigned to Israel. They are present because they are going to give their testimony of what has been happening in Israel. So that is how I understand these four living creatures. They are the key witnesses. I mean, they are there. And here are the four lamps of fire because, I mean, one of the great witnesses is the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is working upon the heart of every person who is there, every being who is there. And the Spirit of God is giving wisdom and also giving impressions that people are able to understand what they are seeing. So all of these beings are present here in heaven. And all of this adds further to the understanding that what we are looking at is actually the judgment. Now, it's 4:38, and I'm thinking that I should stop at this point. I'll just mention quickly that what is about to happen now is the opening of the book of the seven seals. But I think I'm going to leave that till next week so we can do a thorough and comprehensive examination. If we touch it this week, we're only going to brush on the periphery and make a disaster of it. So I'm going to stop here. And next week, we will begin to look in detail at the evidence that is presented in this judgment.